Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you, Cosmin, for having me, and thank you, wonderful team of Parasite. You've been lovely in the past 2 days and extremely helpful. You asked of us to be modest, so I will be very immodest if I insist that I did not co-curate Documenta, but that I was the curator of Documenta. This has to do, of course, in practice I did co-curate it, but Documenta works with a hierarchy. You have one artistic director, which has to do with the history of that institution. You can't have more than one director. And as Roger and I had worked as a team on many exhibitions, this was how we decided to do it. So he was artistic director and I was curator, and I insist on that title. When you just introduced the topic of today, I noticed that there are 3 things you said, and I have to just say this, address you in this before I start with my formal presentation. New models, we need a set of new models. Where do we move from here, and what do we say to each other? And it occurred to me that I really don't know where the concept of a model comes from in a philosophical sense of the word. I have never researched that, I wouldn't know. But I would assume that, my immediate association is a very modernist idea. You're going back, and then you think of the Baroque times, or so you'd have an artistic sketch, and it might also serve as the disegno for then a painting. But the model as such, to me, seems a very modernist concept. But I might be wrong in that. It's just something I want to throw out at you. The second, where do we move from here? Immediately, I would say not forward, please. Maybe sideways, or maybe in many different directions at once. Again, being fearful of progress and all that comes with this idea of moving forward. And maybe because I feel that things are moving too quickly. Maybe just because I'm in a different kind of timing from moving quickly. And then what do we say to each other? Yeah, the eternal question. It's a really important one. I don't have an answer. I'm afraid I won't be answering that question very well in my talk, but it'll be a talk. The best start is art. A bus with this slogan passed me on my hike up the hill. A hill that is, according to Hong Kong tourist websites, called Peak. At some point in history, people attached in a somewhat curious manner to a simple mountainous elevation a description that is ordinarily reserved for a mountain top. One might mistake this for a plain case of pass pro toto, like the roof standing for the house, were it not for the fact that the assignation changes matters. In this example, the part, peak, has a larger degree of pull than the whole, hill. For the peak is what we all want to reach. Isn't the whole point of applying oneself in exercise or discipline the desire to reach the top? Isn't the goal to gain an overview, to be able to look at the landscape below from above? This panoramic position suggests that all is controllable and yet distant, thus giving one the courage to take on new tasks, while suggesting that one won't end up in the middle of the mess. And thus, this pars pro toto imbues the whole with extra significance, illuminates it beyond proportion. Surely it's a particularly beautiful hill we're talking about, in an especially stunning city. But as I was slowly making my sweaty ascent, I could not help being filled with a certain nostalgia. From a European perspective, grandiose attributions are a thing of the past, stemming from modern times, when social progress, another superlative, was yet a possibility, an end to be reached if only society were to exert enough resources, effort, time, and solidarity. Solidarity is the one term that sprung out from the invitation. Originally, is it still in the, but you didn't mention it while you're introducing it, which I found interesting. Nowadays, the peak is not so much defined by individual aspiration, the search for transcendence or social justice, however fictive, but by corporate demand. People are constantly pressed to deliver peak performances. And we of the art world kid ourselves if we think our institutions, discourses, and necessities are far apart. The very suggestion that the speakers at this conference will navigate the spectral contemporary condition of art is a case in point. Is that even possible? Is navigation not a rather large word borrowed from the discourse of statesmanship, when in fact most of us are swimming laps in the neighborhood pool? Maybe the only reason that I object to this use of language in today's invitation is that its demand scares me, asking me to perform at peak capacity when the very idea of defining contemporaneity, of speaking about the state of the art and contributing to a common project of solidarity while filling me with a wish to deliver results in an immediate evacuation of any helpful thought from my mind. Instead of wanton, profuse taxonomy, total blankness reigns. What are the categories that need to be addressed? What is the language to be shared? How are we going to decide on a common project? And is art of any help in answering these questions, which go beyond art, yet without them, why even bother to connect art to the political present at all? In this state of fear or excitement, another encounter with a curious use of superlatives, one also pertaining to Asian landscapes, though urban ones, provides temporary respite. You've all come across it. Though whether you have taken as much pleasure out of its nonsensicality, I don't know. Building flats that are called Profit Mansion or Tycoon's Court, a restaurant chain naming itself a twosome place, a sweet confection called Camembert, or my favorite, a clothing store called Louise Bourgeois. While the first misnomer obviously points to a blatant endorsement of transnational capitalism, the aspirations of the latter follow suit with supporting ideologies, be it the attainment of individual happiness or the availability of bourgeois culture for all. The question is, why do I find these grandiose neologisms endearing? Maybe it is because, contrary to the invitation to rethink new internationalisms, which ask me to participate in a narrative of unity or in a unifying fiction of the real conditions, they appear as symptoms of what philosopher Peter Osborne, amongst others, calls a global transnationalism, a transnationalization. And thus, they allow me to take a step back from the malaise. These symptoms allow me to experience the presence as fragmentary. We would not have these kind of signs in Berlin. And in their failure to fit capitalist ideology like a glove, they give me an opportunity to distance myself from the all-encompassing neoliberal imperative for constant self-optimization. Maybe the symptom is also the cure. Maybe the drive has been displaced from an internal relation onto the hill. For the hill is the peak. So for the hill is the peak. If it is the peak, I'm already in La La Land and might as well sit on a bench halfway up and enjoy the nature around me. It is a rather beautiful day, not too hot, not too muggy. Needless to say, the reverie did not last long. Eventually, I made it up to the top, and there discovered, to my astonishment, a shopping mall. Which thoroughly offended my European sensibility. Whatever happened to the concept of the picturesque? Though in a highly perverse way, to put a mall on top of a hill might be construed as a form of the capitalist sublime. In any case, the shock served to deflate my nascent theories. I had been thinking about the problem at hand from a very particular geopolitical place, one that did not take into account that from a Hong Kong perspective, what I perceived to be symptoms that point to the contradiction in ideology might just prove to be irrelevant. Despite global transnationalization, diverse value systems might still be in place. To make a most banal analogy, diverse contexts feed into the meaning of a sign. Just compare the following of what I have been showing to what I've been showing you. A still from Godard's Deux, Trois Choses, Mike Kelly's Gospel Rocket. Sorry, I took these from the net yesterday late at night, so they're small. Glenn Ligon's America, and this very cut and very small. The Warsaw Museum of Modern Art's temporary location, it's the sign advertising temporary location at Sliska Street, or Mu Chen's installation in Shanghai. The point is that the often implicit cultures of gauging value, meaning, and risk cannot be contained in the categories of either economy or art, either locality or globalization, or what people in the art world nowadays fashionably call the planetary. Take the category of the contemporary. Peter Osborne argues in an essay to be published in my forthcoming anthology about approaching the museum with migration in mind, that competing geopolitical constructions of the contemporary result in competing periodizations of contemporary art. This is because the temporal unity we call contemporaneity is a fiction. Ask yourself, when did the present begin? There is no shared subject position of or within the present. But it is a fiction which nevertheless functions, regulating, as Osborne says, the division of past and present within the present. Osborne shows that, that precisely because of the growing social interconnectedness, the fiction of contemporaneity is being filled with meaningful content and thus slowly transformed from a fiction into a fictional narrative into a historical narrative. At the same time, it has assumed transcendental status, hence what today's conference calls the spectral contemporary condition of art acquires its urgency. All this might seem benign unless one follows one current art critical periodization of contemporary art as that of art after 1989, which, according to Osborne, is art that must reflectively incorporate the systemic functionalization of autonomy itself and here I quote again, the global transnationalization of the Biennale as an exhibition form and its integration into the logics of international politics and regional development, into its procedures, if it is. So what he's saying is that, so art has to acknowledge that and actually deal with it if it is to remain contemporary. So in a way, artistic practice is forced to perform according to that model, or at least to that content. Within the art market for this art, signification, he says, of nationality, ethnicity, and race identities function both as elements within broader transnational sets of geopolitical relations, condensing particular contemporaneities, and as a mean of commodification of political cultures. This is its basic, often contradictory dynamic. Oh, sorry, that was too quick. It goes downhill from here on. By this time, I'm thoroughly depressed, despite the fact that walking down is always easier than up. Because in principle, I believe that Osborne's argument is valid, though I take a different perspective on the power of institutions. In my experience, they are not as hegemonic and stable as he makes them out to be. As I'm contemplating my options, obviously, solidarity necessitates collective political action, and I doubt it makes sense to strive for collective political action within the art system. The bus passes me again, its slogan mocking me now. Best start with art. So I do. Actually, it's more like an end. Best end with art, but as it's the start of the conference, maybe it's still suggestive. For example, with Sheila Gouda's Protest My Son from 2011, and this is from an installation at her present solo show at Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven. The title derives from Gouda's fascination with the names of members of the Haki-Piki tribe derived from their encounter with modern urbanity. So protest is an actual name of a person, one she knows, but there's a double entendre since the photo, blown up in billboard in advertising size and duplicated in a smaller image, stems from a newspaper article on the process of Haki-Piki against the government's demolishment of their dwellings in suburban Bangalore, with a false promise of building public housing. For this protest, people have dressed up in traditional clothes, dramatically staging their tribal identity against the background of mainstream stereotypes and media politics. Unfortunately, I do not have the time to delve further into Gouda's installation today. For the reason I'm showing it to you is that she comments on her own intervention with the following words. But what I do with this particular image should not be read as that sympathy for the downtrodden syndrome in all its naivete. I'm fearful of this interpretation more than of Dalit organizations or even of the Haki-Piki responding aggressively by misreading me as an artist, a city person, unaware of or indifferent to the struggle of marginalized communities. She goes on to contemplate this and then says, actually, I want to be seen doing wrong, to be a modern colonialist. I find the option of conscious abuse of the image very compelling. Let me show you a second work, an untitled portrait by Juan Davila from 1986 of a Chilean worker named El Guaren, the big rat, that translates to. There's a lot going on in this painting, at least the least of which is that El Guaren is posing naked on all four limbs on a freeway, urinating. Davila's practice, his imagery and style repudiate the self-involved Western aesthetics and theory that only talks of revolution, but not of class, sex, or ethnicity. In the artist's words, this man is not the Duchampian desiring machine. He's Chilean, working class, and has a desiring gaze. He looks at us from the edge of the industrial world as a subject. Late capitalism has put the subject to sleep, and the representation of a desiring subject is one of the possibilities that the artist has to reawaken another view of everyday life. Inevitably, the desiring subjectivity, I think, the artist is representing is his own, and for that he became the most hated artist of Documenta 12. Both Sheila Gouda and Juan Davila, despite their different strategies, seem to know one thing, and this is with a thought with which I'd like to end. A prerequisite to solidarity is to acknowledge one's own vulnerability. It is a first, albeit small, and certainly not more than a first step in parting with privilege. And unless we part with our privileges, there is no international solidarity to be had, no international language. Thank you.
So, any questions?
Or comments.
Or comments.
It's so strange when people are asked only to phrase what they want to say in question form.
Thank you, Ruth. Well, I don't have a question as such. It's more of a comment. Well, it's a series of comments, I suppose. Well, why did I leave solidarity out from the introduction? I guess it was primarily because of the call for modesty that was also part of it. Because in a way, I think that's the most. There's definitely the elephant in the room of all the grand statements of the introduction and of the invitation, of course, and in a way that is definitely the elephant in the room of any kind of discussions that we are having in the art world, and especially in this context of what are the limits and the borders of our new planetary reality. I heard that as well. It's very funny. Well, thank you very much for your presentation, because in a way it did. You were promising indeed more of a rebuke of the premises, but that's not how I read them. The presentation. Well, I guess we can get more into details in the actual plenary session, but I wanted to just have this spontaneous reaction to it. But thank you.
It's a really great beginning for something. So parting, in your terms, would be a way of beginning something else. Well, is there anything more you could say? How are we to part with privilege? And what kind of privilege or privileges you have in mind? Of course, we are already in the kind of privileged position here. And how would that lead to solidarity?
Well, first of all, I think this is something that probably not just one individual should be answering. But I think there are very, very banal aspects to it. One being very noticeable in Europe at the moment with the disbanding of the welfare state, and our fear, our European fear of becoming poor, actually, and what it reacts in. It reacts in, for instance, in a certain kind of xenophobia that is quite scary. And I would say that that there's a long way to go towards poverty before, and maybe precarity. Not that I'm saying that this is a good thing, but I think that we all probably agree that unless in economic and social terms things level out, we're not going to get a just world at all. And that's not just a north-south issue, but it also is a north-south issue. So it's just very, on that, you know, there was I remember when I was still living in Austria, there was this question that unions weren't taking care of migrant workers who were illegal. Yeah, so it wasn't something that was encompassed, that people who are working in recognized workplaces are not taking care of reproductive work that's happening unpaid at the home. It's not an issue that is thought of, you know, they're not thought of dealing with that, because it would immediately mean that they would get less, they would have to share. It's a very pragmatic argument I make.
Hi. Sitting here on the right-hand side. Thanks for your presentation. I was just wondering about the term vulnerability, which maybe chains into some of the other ones, which have this more of an ethical kind of touch, like solidarity, etc. My question would be not a philosophical question or geopolitical, but more like narrowing it down maybe to the curatorial concerns. You mentioned yourself that, of course, the curatorial work is, kind of under pressure from various sides, also being part of neoliberalism, et cetera, et cetera. But how do you envision the curatorial work to function in terms of also an ethical activity, taking into account the production maybe of vulnerability or solidarity?
Well, maybe just to answer about the vulnerability, I've been in this extremely privileged position by doing probably one of the most fantastic curatorial jobs one could do, doing Documenta. And then I found myself afterwards quite knowing that this would happen, but nevertheless unprepared for being cast back into a situation of precarity and economically quite a vulnerable situation. And in fact, invitations started to teeter out until I got this job at the Royal College, upon which immediately the invitations start coming again. Now, Cosman and I have had a longer relationship. She didn't invite me because I'm head of the Royal College. But you could see that this was happening. Now, that was a period of 5 times, very scary in a certain way, right? Now, I could have done what most people would have done in my situation, which is taking on a lot of curatorial work. By applying to foundations and other institutions, doing the kind of thing that most people who are working as curators have to do anyways. I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to be forced by the economy to curate. In a way, I became stubbornly not curating, even though I was curating in my head all the time. And I was doing exhibitions. I'm doing one that's called Sleeping with a Vengeance, Dreaming of a Life. That is actually about sleep as a form of subversion against capitalism. And I've been doing this exhibition in my mind for several years now, and at some point it'll have a materialization. Now, most of the curators I know quite rightly feel that they need to, that they can't afford that. They can't make themselves vulnerable like that by not doing the work in the kind of timing and framing in it in the way that it's supposed to be. Similar problem for artists, huh? Those artists that chose to stay out of the market in some way, put themselves up to similar vulnerabilities and precarities. Now, whether that directly ties, in this case, back to solidarity, I'm not so sure. Because, again, maybe it's very difficult to be solidaric if you're yourself vulnerable, and it's much more easy to divest yourself of privilege and thereby becoming solidaric. And maybe we can't be in solidarity all the time in our lives.
Ruth, I had a question regarding your new role as the director at the RCA, because I didn't sort of get a feel for your reflections on this role, and in terms of what, as a teacher, what kinds of encounters, what kinds of challenges you want to put forward in your new role, also with the reality of your students being fee-paying clients.
That's a really important point. It's been still so new to me that I'm still in the process of trying to grasp what it is, coming from a position where I said we don't need more curators, and to teaching, actually producing curators, and being asked by the institution to also produce more. So from a time when this program was founded 20 years ago, and it was quite an elite program of having 12 people, we're now supposed to take in every year 20, and then the year afterwards more. The institution doesn't really think about what these people will be doing afterwards. I think everyone's assuming that it works according to the kind of capitalist expensive model, and I'm pretty sure that that's not the case. So it's a bit of a problem for me. In terms of the fee-paying situation, I'm still not sure that it's really actually possible to teach people who are paying fees, because the pressure to be a servicing person is very, very strong, and it comes at the moment when the conflicts, when you're provoking the conflicts that need to be there, that are conflicts about authority, contexts about power, that can be enacted. It can be enacted both by the students and by the institution. And so it's a riddle to me at the moment. It's an incredible problem, and I haven't solved that yet. And probably my institution hates me for even saying something like that in public.
May I? Yes? Can I do a last one thing?
Last question.
Right. Yeah, it's a comment and question. When you brought the subject of biennials, let me think if I understood correctly. I guess it's in the same reading that biennials, they reconciled differences. No, they are a platform that reconcile, and maybe that's the grand model after the many process of how multiculturalism developed in different areas. So it is this idea of the reconciliatory, but the grand question is, I guess, how the introduction to this whole setting was, well, is it, no? Or if that model is kind of set, then what could be other models? When you suggested, when thinking of other models, you said that it brought you back to the past and thinking of modernity, and I'm trying to understand more in relation to the document that you curated. Somehow there was an investment to think that modernity had actually manifested simultaneously in different parts of the world in different forms, or you even call it the migration of forms. And maybe just like, how do you see that as I mean, was that also seen as an internationalism, that you thought that it did actually manifested in a different way, or was it actually different things, different utopias that were being spoken at simultaneous times?
Well, it's been over 5 years, and I'm actually quite, although of course it's been very decisive for me in my development, this document, it's also something that is, thank God, been replaced by the next one. But if I'm asked to go back, I would say there wasn't much reconciliation in our documenta. It was really set to provoke, and it did indeed provoke a lot of people. So it was really more about making propositions and making them in such a way. We were saying we are trying to turn as many formats into process as possible, to get from representation into process. And having said that, I think that maybe if I would propose something that we need to go forward with, this is to start thinking about exhibitions and reflecting upon them and talking about them more as intertextual. So not to always think of them as singular events, as if we're not learning from other exhibitions, as if they're on their own. I think that's a pretty sad thing that happens, that there's this amnesia. So people make these incredible things, and it always opens up questions that cannot just be addressed by one curator or one artist, and that need to be taken up by others. And sometimes they are taken up by others, but implicitly. But there is no culture of talking about that. And I think that's a big problem. I think that would be something I would very much like to see happening, that there's a culture of talking with each other about what we learn from each other as curators. And how we can, to think of exhibitions not as singular events.
Okay. Any last comments? Just one last one.
If you could shortly just elaborate more about the notion of contemporaneity. I know it's maybe not the best last question. Maybe leave it for tomorrow. But yeah,
maybe
I was not fast enough to grab the mic.
We should do that tomorrow. I have to say that what I was culling from, or was taking this is not my idea. I took that really from Peter Osborne. He's just. And he just wrote this this essay for me for that publication, which will be online in a month or so. But he's also made an extended argument about art and philosophy in a new book that's coming out on the 18th of this month, which is, should know what it's called, but I'll find it out for you. But I think he makes it a much better argument about it than I do. But it does leave one with a hesitation to use that word quite so easily as a positive term. And one of the things he shows is, the different kinds of periodizations and that are going alongside each other. So you have, for instance, a model of contemporary art starting after 1945, right? And then you have the model of contemporary art as that which starts in the 60s, and it's, beginning of the 60s, but 68 is always quoted. And these have different, and he shows the effects these have. So he's not saying one is better than the other. They work alongside, and they're validated in institutions alongside each other. But they have different ways of approaching what is the present and not. But they all share a fictionality in a certain way. And that he proves in philosophical terms. He explains why in philosophical terms the whole concept is a very problematic one. So.
Thank you, Ruth, for her presentation and answers.